Hey, what's up? Today, I'm gonna show you a recipe for the easiest, actually good cinnamon rolls you can make at home. This recipe doesn't require a stand mixer, and it goes from mix to oven in only about 90 minutes, most of that time being passive. Plus, the form factor for these cinnamon rolls is pretty unique and kind of quirky, but awesome. To get started, into a saucepan, I'll drop 115 grams or one whole stick of butter and just melt it gently. A few seconds later, I'll kill the heat so the butter doesn't get too hot. Then I'll drop in 225 grams of plain Greek yogurt. Big shout out to Stella Parks from Brave Tart, by the way, for showing me how perfect yogurt is for a cinnamon roll. It's got protein, moisture, acidity, and fat all at the same time, and it makes for a really rich, tender cinnamon roll with just a little bit of twang. Next, I'll add in 115 grams of milk and then stir everything combine. Try to keep the temperature here between 85 and 90 F. If the mixture gets too hot, it's going to make it impossible to develop the gluten in just a second. From here, I'll drop my butter-gurt milk mixture into a bowl along with 7 grams or 1 packet's worth of instant yeast. Then I'll stir that to combine. Since we're going to be hand mixing this dough, it really helps to make sure that the yeast is fully hydrated before we add in the dry stuff. Speaking of that, next in goes 450 grams of all-purpose flour, 100 grams of sugar, 2 grams of baking soda, and 8 grams of salt. From here, I'll grab a sturdy spoon and just stir the wet stuff into the dry stuff. And once it should look like this. That's not dough yet. So to continue this mix, I'm going to switch from a spoon to a soaking wet hand. Then I'll squeeze everything together until it unifies into a homogeneous mass. From there, I'll switch over to a kneading motion right in the bowl. Use whatever movement feels natural to you here. You just want to make sure that you're getting some effort or force put into the dough, because that's what ends up linking the gluten proteins. In total, I'll give this dough 3 minutes of assertive elbow greasing. Then I'll bring in just a little bit more strength and organization to the gluten by rounding and tucking this dough into a tidy little ball. I know this isn't the prettiest dough that we've ever made on this channel, but trust me, you guys are going to shit when you see what this turns into in about an hour and a half. Now I'll drop a lid on the bowl and check back in 15 minutes. 15 minutes later, when I come back, you can see that this dough is not strong enough to hold itself together, let alone be rolled up full of cinnamon sugar. So I'm gonna knead it one more time for 3 minutes. And if you're wondering, hey Bri, why didn't we just knead this dough more in the first step? Well, this dough has a lot of sugar, fat, and milk products in it, and those inhibit gluten formation. Giving the dough a short rest allows it to hydrate and activate more gluten protein. This means that during the second knead, we have more potential glutens in there to link up, so we can get the dough quite a bit stronger than if we had kneaded it for 6 minutes up front. And after about 3 minutes, this dough should be able to stand up to the tug test, and it does. So I'm gonna drop it back in the bowl, then round it into a tidy ball one more time, then the lid goes on and I'll ferment it for 75 more minutes. To mix this dough in a stand mixer, if you've got one, I would say rip it on medium-high speed for 8 to 10 minutes. One caveat, when you're mixing highly enriched doughs like this one in a stand mixer, friction becomes an issue and you can heat up this dough and potentially degrade the gluten network. So if you decide to use your stand mixer, instead of heating the yogurt mixture to 85 to 90 F, I would say heat it to 75 to 80 just to be safe. Now, while the hand-mixed dough is rising, let's make the cinnamon sugar filling. For that, I'll drop 115 grams of a very soft butter into a bowl. Then I'll hit it with 150 grams of brown sugar, 20 grams of cinnamon, and 1 grams of salt. Next, I'll grab a spatula and smear the butter into the sugar and cinnamon. If your butter is nice and soft, that shouldn't take more than about a dozen stirs. And once the butter sugar looks like damp sand, I'm gonna move from a spatula to a spoon, then whip this butter sugar vigorously to try and cream it out a little bit. Creaming is a process that kind of fuses the butter and sugar together in a way that stirring doesn't. It's usually done with a stand mixer for things like cookies, but in this context, it helps keep the butter from melting out the bottom of the cinnamon roll. Of course, we can't cream by hand like we would be able to with the stand mixer, but 60 seconds of whipping this butter mixture with a spoon gets us pretty close and gives us a product that stays put inside the roll a lot better than if we had just stirred the butter with the sugar. Now, after 75 minutes of rising, I'm gonna come back and preheat my oven to 375 F, then check back on my dough. As you can see, it's just about doubled in size and it's looking nice and strong. Before I roll out this beauty of a dough, I want to thank Bob's Red Mill for milling the flour that I used to mix it. I switched over to using exclusively Bob's products well before they sponsored any of my videos, and I've been on that stuff for well over 4 years now. The unbleached white all-purpose flour that I'm using in this video just never steers me wrong. I love it because it's very high quality, it goes through a ton of testing to ensure product safety, and most importantly for me, it's a consistent product. That's really important for baking at home in general, but it's especially especially important for me who develops recipes for other people to use, so the flour's gotta be the same every single time. And Bob's is. Beyond being a total simp for the unbleached white all-purpose flour, I also love all the other flours, grains, and cereals that Bob's mills. Special shout out goes to the gluten-free 1-to-1 flour and Bob's superfine almond flour. Since Lauren's gluten-free, these are in heavy rotation at my house. In fact, we just used that 1-to-1 flour to do a GF version of my chocolate chip cookie recipe, and it hit real right. You can conveniently find Bob's gluten-free flours and all of Bob's other products on Amazon. Check out the link to my Amazon storefront down in my description to see some of my favorite Bob's products. I'm looking at you, Polenta. This is a great company with great products, and I'm really stoked to be partnering with them. If you want to check out their products, again, click the link in my description. You're gonna love them. Thank you, Bob's. Now to roll out these cinnamon rolls, I'm gonna flip this dough onto a lightly floured work surface, degas it a little bit with the flat of my hand to pop any large bubbles, then a touch more flour to keep things from sticking, then I'll grab my pin and roll this out with a few slow, deliberate movements to spread the dough evenly. One thing that hand mixing has over stand mixing here is that the dough is weaker, which is bad for most things, but it's actually quite nice for cinnamon rolls because it makes it really easy to spread out. Strong doughs tend to snap back and can get a little bit tough and toothsome from being overworked with a rolling pin. At this point, I'm just gonna push this pin out into the corners to get the oval turned into more of a rectangle. Then I'll get the other corner, and once I've got this evenly spread out and rolled to about a 1/2 inch thick, I'll call it good. Widthwise, I'm looking for about 12 inches and length 16 to 17. Next, I'll drop down all of my hand creamed sugar butter, and I'll use a spatula to spread that out as evenly as I can. Try not to use downward pressure to spread this out because that's just gonna smush the dough and not really move the butter. Instead, try to keep the back of the spatula flat and glide it over the butter in long, shallow, low motions. Think of it like spreading creamy peanut butter on a piece of white bread. The more you press it, the more the white bread's gonna get torn up. And once the sugary butt is spread from edge to edge, I'm gonna roll this thing up. For that, I'll grab just the tip of the end and barely fold it over, like maybe an inch max. Then I'll tuck that in and crimp it down, and from there, I'll push forward 90 degrees or about 2 inches, then I'll pull back towards myself while tucking things in. Again, I'll roll forward 2 inches, then pull the dough back towards myself slightly to keep things nice and tight. I'll also pinch slightly as I do that. This movement might seem a little bit fussy and overly deliberate, but it makes a huge difference in terms of structural integrity. This creates a tight spiral with a lot of tension, which leads to a huge oven spring and a beautiful spiral look in the final roll. This movement is actually very similar to how you would shape a baguette. As you roll, you're pulling back to create internal tension, and that really helps it explode in the oven. And once I get towards the top here, I'm gonna slide the whole thing down in front of me, then I'm gonna shore up the ends, then I'm gonna roll the whole thing over the seam while pushing down slightly to make sure that gets sealed up. That's also a baguette move. Now to break this into individual rolls, I'm gonna grab my razor sharp Lagerstrom 8-inch chef's knife and cut off both of the ends. If you want a sick knife and to help support this channel, these are available for sale now. Link in description. Once the ends are cleaned up, I'm gonna wipe my knife clean with a damp towel to keep the sugar from smearing. Then I'm gonna cut the entire thing in half. If you don't have a super sharp knife like this one, I would say try a serrated knife. Ooh, baby, look at that nice spiral. Next, I'll cut both halves into 3 pieces, giving me 6 rolls in total. Then I'm gonna grab a muffin pan. Specifically, I've got a 6-count jumbo pan here. Certainly, you could cut your rolls down into 12s if you have a smaller muffin pan, or if you prefer softer sides, you could bake this in an 8 to 9 inch brownie pan. I'll show you the process for that in just a second. Next, I'll spray my muffin or cupcake pan with some pan spray, then I'll load in my cut cinnamon rolls. For this recipe, I prefer a muffin pan because I think it makes for a really unique, aesthetically pleasing, texturally dynamic product. For now, I'm gonna load these cinnamon rolls right into my 375F oven to bake for 40 to 55 minutes. Cut to one of the best time lapses in the history of this channel, but also possibly of all time. Oh, and after 45 to 50 minutes at 375, it's time to pull these bad babies out of the oven. Dude, these are sickeningly sick looking. Look at the level of golden brown. Oh, Look at the spiral. Look at the bubbly cinnamon sugar, you guys. Now, I'm gonna need to set these up on a wire rack to cool down so they don't get too browned in the pan, and I'll come back with icing in 10 minutes. To make these cinnamon rolls in a brownie pan, first I'm gonna roll them up into a slightly longer tube that's about 18 to 20 inches instead of the 12 to 24. Then I'll cut it down into 9 pieces and load it into a sprayed 8 to 9 inch brownie pan 3x3. Next, I'll bake these things covered with foil for 35 minutes. Then at the 35-minute mark, I'll remove the foil. This keeps the cinnamon rolls from getting all wacky in the oven. Cut to some rolls that I baked without foil. Those are downright zany, and they're not gonna bake evenly. After defoiling, I'll bake for 10 to 15 more minutes or until they reach the desired level of golden brown. Once they're baked, I'll slide them over to a wire rack to cool, then slather them with cream cheese icing. How do you make that? Well, into a bowl, I'll combine 25 grams of cream cheese with 75 grams of heavy cream. Next, I'll whisk the cream cheese into the cream to work out any lumpiness. Then I'll grab 150 grams of powdered sugar and drop that on top. Then a tiny pinch of salt. From here, I'll whisk until everything is combined, and this looks a little bit thick. So I'm gonna add in about 10 grams of water or cream, and that'll give this icing just a little bit more of a saucy texture. Now, the most aesthetically pleasing way to use this icing on these cinnamon rolls is to gently drizzle a couple of ziggies right on top. This is great for getting likes on Instagram, but for me, the real way to ice these things is to just smear the icing all over the top and the sides. Get it in the spirals, get it all over your fingers, and just slop it on there. This just makes for an epic eating experience. The icing saturates the exterior and soaks deep into the cracks and crevices, bringing that sweet, twangy hit from the cream cheese to almost every bite. Now let's taste this thing. The big question is, how do you do the first bite? Do you peel it open or you just go whole hog into the side of it? Here we go. What? Texturally, this thing is extremely dynamic. You get some crystallized crunchy sugar right on the bottom, then you get a little bit of a brioche, I don't want to say chewy, but you get a little bit of a toothsome bread bite on the outside, and then it's just squishy, gooey cinnamon roll all the way through. It's so good. If you want another easier version of a classic baked good, check out this video for my easiest actually good baguette. I'll see you there.